The Scottish Parliament had no choice but to accept defeat and pledge allegiance to King Edward I of England after England and Scotland had been at war for 8 years. The last rebellion of the Scottish forces, led by William Wallace, had retreated and gone into hiding. Now the Scottish Parliament had to pay regular taxes to England and form a new council led by the King of England's deputy, Aymer de Valence. Meanwhile, 2 claimants to the Scottish throne, John Comyn and Robert Bruce, were not chosen. The English king had also returned lands taken during the battles and arranged for Robert Bruce to marry the Scottish noblewoman Elizabeth de Burgh, who was also King Edward's goddaughter. However, upon returning to Scotland, it was clear they had not accepted defeat. Robert Bruce's father, also named Robert, was now the leader of Scotland and urged his children to be patient and enjoy the peace, especially since their family now greatly benefited by being in charge. Sometime later, Robert, now very old, recounted his closeness with King Edward I. When they were young, they were friends who went on the Crusades to Jerusalem and trusted each other. However, Edward, whom he trusted, ended up overthrowing their kingdom. After telling his story, Robert died. After Robert's death, his eldest son, Robert Bruce, took over leadership. Robert Bruce then headed to the English-Scottish border to pay the regular taxes, despite his mourning. Upon arrival, they were shocked by the arrival of English soldiers carrying parts of a body. The soldiers hung the body parts on a crucifix. The Scots were horrified to read the name attached to the parts. It was the body of William Wallace, the last Scottish warrior. This caused the locals to resist, leading to a commotion. Robert Bruce was quickly taken back to the kingdom. Back at the kingdom, Robert Bruce, unable to accept what had happened, decided to tell his brothers that he would rebel against the English kingdom and break their sacred vow to King Edward I. He believed he had to unite the Scottish kingdoms because he thought Wallace's defeat was due to their disunity. Robert immediately went to see John Comyn, who was in the Holy Land, the Greyfriars Church in Dumfries. Their meeting did not go well because John accused Robert of being preoccupied with his claim to the throne and not fighting alongside Wallace. John also threatened to inform the English of Robert's betrayal plans. Shocked by the threat, Robert responded by stabbing and killing John Comyn. News of John Comyn's murder quickly spread throughout Scotland and England. The leaders and clergy then discussed what action to take. Should they exile Robert as requested by the Pope and the Vatican, or support him, making him the King of Scotland and leading the fight for Scotland's independence once more? The clergy decided to crown Robert as the new King of Scotland, and Robert quickly began his rebellion. All Scottish nobles supported him due to the clergy's information about Robert's wise leadership. On the other hand, the English were greatly shocked by Robert's actions. They declared Robert an outlaw, and the Prince of Wales asked his father for permission to lead an army to Scotland to capture Robert. Robert Bruce was crowned King of Scotland, becoming Robert I, although he didn't receive full support from all the Scottish kingdoms. Robert quickly gathered his forces and headed to the border. Along the way, he met a displaced nobleman, James Douglas, son of William Douglas, who had died in captivity after the war. James had been dispossessed of his lands, which were given to an English noble. This left him devastated, so he joined Robert. James would later be known as Black Douglas for his fierce battle cries. There, they encountered Aymer de Valence, who had been appointed by the English king to govern Scotland. They both prepared for battle. Robert the Vivant invited Valence to duel, but Valence declined, citing the sacred day and proposing to duel the next day. However, that night, as Robert's forces rested, Valence launched a surprise attack. This scattered the Scottish forces, forcing Robert and his family to flee with only a few soldiers, while the rest were slaughtered by Valence's troops. Robert's crushing defeat led the English to rampage through Scotland, destroying places that supported Robert's rebellion. Meanwhile, Robert and his forces kept hiding, evading their pursuers. They crossed the lands of the MacDougall to reach Islay, where Angus Og was. At the lake's edge, they found a boat that was too small, requiring them to cross in turns. However, after just one trip, Lord MacDougall arrived and massacred them. Fortunately, they managed to escape, though their numbers dwindled to around 40 men. Robert's brother Alexander was killed in the river. They then encountered the clan MacKinnon and invited them to join, but MacKinnon declined. they continued their journey to meet Angus. Meanwhile, the English, led by the Prince of Wales, visited Kildrummy Castle, where Elizabeth and Robert's child were hiding. Although Elizabeth attempted to flee, they were captured by the Prince of Wales's soldiers. Robert's brother, Neil Bruce, was also hanged at this castle for treason. Robert was devastated upon hearing the news. He had lost 2 brothers at once. Not wanting to prolong the pursuit by the English troops, Robert launched a covert resistance by first reclaiming their own castles. In short, Robert managed to take control of their castles by infiltrating through a wood carrier. Then James Douglas asked Robert for permission to reclaim his lands. Robert agreed, and they quickly captured James Douglas's castle, which was then controlled by an English garrison. In the English prison, Queen Elizabeth was asked to sign a divorce decree with Robert to be freed from punishment. Elizabeth would continue to be punished, as she was seen as the enemy's queen. However, steadfast in her loyalty to her husband, Elizabeth refused and had to endure even harsher punishment. She was placed in a small cage and hung above the castle. Robert launched another major attack with 50 of his men. They did this intentionally to lure the English kingdom into directly engaging them, as Robert and his soldiers no longer wanted to hide and were ready for open confrontation. Consequently, Robert's actions were noticed by King Edward I, who quickly mustered a large army to the border to crush Robert. During the journey, the elderly King Edward fell ill and could no longer continue. After resting at the camp, King Edward eventually died. At that moment, the Prince of Wales was crowned King Edward II, succeeding his father, and continued the march to Scotland. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Robert had gained support from many kingdoms and gathered around 500 soldiers. Robert knew that although the English were strong, they were unfamiliar with the geography of Scotland. Robert took advantage of this by creating trenches filled with sharp stakes and muddy swamps on either side. In short, the English troops, led by King Edward II, arrived. James Douglas held his forces before entering Scottish land and ordered them to wait until the next day for the battle at Loudon Hill, not far from where both sides faced off. The next morning, both royal armies rallied their troops. Without much ado, Edward II ordered his cavalry, led by Aymer de Valence, to attack first with half their forces. As the cavalry approached, the English troops fell into Robert's trench traps. Meanwhile, those entering through the swamp were slaughtered. The English forces began to falter, and Valence ordered his troops to turn and attack from the side. However, they ended up falling into the muddy swamp trap again. Edward II, extremely enraged by this, moved his entire cavalry to attack directly. Another fierce battle ensued. Finally, after the muddy battle, the English troops, exhausted and realizing they could not possibly win against the Scottish defenses, retreated. It was then that the two kings, King Robert I and King Edward II, faced each other in a duel. Without much delay, Robert, who was more skilled in swordsmanship, defeated Edward. However, Robert did not kill him. Edward II and his troops left in defeat. The Battle of Loudon Hill marked a turning point in Robert's struggle to reclaim Scotland from English rule. He then gained support from the Scottish lords. Meanwhile, James Douglas, also known as Black Douglas, reclaimed his lands and became one of the most feared lords by his enemies. On the other hand, the Prince of Wales, now Edward II, was eventually killed by English nobles themselves. Robert reunited with his family, and Elizabeth was freed through a prisoner exchange. 300 years later, the descendants of King Robert I would inherit the throne and succeed in ruling Scotland, Ireland, and even England, uniting them under their rule. His descendant, James VI, would become James I of the union of the crowns of Scotland and England. James VI also envisioned himself as the King of Great Britain and Ireland, and the movie ends. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, because by subscribing you have supported me to make better videos. See you in the next video.